All right, shall we get started? My name is Justin Bengry. I direct the MA Queer History and convene the Centre for Queer History here at Goldsmiths. I'm really delighted to welcome you all here today to learn about Phil Polglaze's photos, the context in which they were created, and why it's so important to remember these histories. I'm delighted to welcome you here. It's always great to do live in-person events. So much of what we've had to do for so long has been remote online. So it's really special to see people in person. If you didn't have a chance to take a look at the photos in the period before the talk, please feel free to stick around afterwards and have a closer look. Take one of the information sheets that describes where each of the photos was taken. Feel free to grab a card if you're interested in studying here or just following up with me or anyone in queer history at Goldsmiths. Take several, leave them on buses, give them to friends, all of that. With that, I would like to turn it over to Hilke Golbach to start the introductions.
Thank you. I was going to do a proper stand-up for this, if that's okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight, which is promising to be a very special evening. I'm sorry, I have messed up my order of my papers. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight in really, really good company in the audience, but especially here in the panel. And I kind of want to begin by thanking Goldsmiths really, and Justin and Isabel for making the event happen at what is a very busy time for them. And thank you, of course, also to the speakers who are here tonight. So Phil Polglaze to begin with, the photographer, Bruce Reid and Terry Munyard, who will be in conversation tonight. And this is kind of a reunion of sorts. I just heard that Bruce and Phil regularly speak to each other. But Terry and Phil haven't seen each other in 30 or 35 years. So I'm very excited about what will be discussed tonight. I will properly introduce you all in a minute, but I first wanted to say a few words about the reason we're here and the subject that we're going to be talking about this evening. Until last year, I worked as the curator of photographs at the Museum of London. And for those of you who are actually not that familiar with the Museum of London, it's really worth looking at the photography collection there, which is kind of like a visual history of London from the 19th century to today. It includes kind of vernacular photography and photo albums, as well as like really special historic objects and work by really quite well-known artists, including Chloe Dew Matthews, Stephen Gill, Sunil Gupta, and since recently also Phil Polglaze. The museum is actually about to move to another site. I say about, but it's really kind of in 2 years from now, which means that the building is closed, but a lot of the collection is still accessible online, including Phil's photographs as well. So if you don't know the Museum of London that well, it's really worth taking a look. So this is kind of where Phil and I first met at the Museum of London, right? Yes. When he reached out to us with his bog jobs.
Yeah.
That's the title you've given these photographs.
Well, that's what they are, really. When you think of it, they're awful places, but you have to have a hook of a name, don't you, really?
Yeah, and it's a very good description.
A middle-eight.
It's a very good description for an archive of images taken in public toilets.
Yeah.
And you produced these between 1979 and 1996, at a time when UK socio-political climate was shaped by conservative opposition to homosexuality, Section 28, and obviously the AIDS crisis. And Phil told me that he had made these photographs on commission from 2 lawyers in order to help aid the legal defense
That's right.
of men who were accused of cottaging. This was not a very uncommon charge at the time, as police were kind of working openly working for an openly homophobic government. And they were actively persecuting men for gross indecency and buggery in public places. But it was a charge that could be pretty disastrous for the defendant and could even lead to a prison sentence. So there was a lot of stake, I guess. So I knew immediately that this was quite a special set of images. I'd never seen anything quite like it before. And, as a historic record of queer history, the images document the public toilet as a type of unsurveyed urban space that embody the possibility of sexual encounter with someone of the same sex, albeit at a risk. But they also represent a fairly recent history of the oppression of and persecution of homosexuality. Many of the toilets that Phil photographed have since been knocked down or boarded up or converted into something else. But I think perhaps more intriguingly, the photographs themselves should maybe not have survived. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But yeah, the original function of these images was not to serve as a social historical record, but as a criminal record. They were used in court to demonstrate to the judge and jury in the courtroom what the particular crime scene of a cottaging case looked like. And by showing certain sidelines and perspectives from within the toilets, the images help to challenge the prosecution's statement and exonerate the defendant, hopefully. So cleverly, the photographs never actually show the defendants, apart from maybe a case or two.
On occasion, you ask somebody to stand physically where the evidence is pointed to actually give a distance factor, or if someone's observing something, then you try to incorporate that in the image so that the jury can see, is it possible?
Yeah. And sometimes that person might have been one of the lawyers, and sometimes it might have been you or a friend, but hardly ever the defendant.
But it was either my friend Ian Fairweather, the planner. He would appear in a couple. Unfortunately, in the photographs in front of you, he doesn't appear in any of them.
Maybe he'll come up in a minute on the screen.
He may.
So yeah, anyway, the main point was to fill in gaps in the imagination of the judge and jury, who could not be expected to visit these grubby places, in order to kind of produce a piece of photographic evidence that was as accurate as possible. And what's interesting about that is the point that they weren't used to prove a crime, but to disprove it. And I think we'll be talking about that a lot in a minute. How did you go about that?
Yeah, you had to retain as much as you can a visual neutrality.
Exactly.
This is the important thing.
Yeah. So outside of these trials, in the 1980s and 1990s, these photographs have not been seen by a wider public, and they've only really resurfaced in the last couple of years. They're now in the Museum of London's collection, but they really haven't been seen or published very much. And so Phil saved them in his darkroom for a very long time. And now they help us, to tell like really an important piece of LGBT history at the Museum of London. So there's a lot to unpack about these photographs in terms of queer history, disappeared architectures, notions of photographic evidence, and the socio-political context in which they were taken. And it's really special, as I said, to have you all here tonight with Bruce Reid and Terry Munyard, the solicitor and barrister who commissioned these images, nearly 3 decades after the last photograph was taken. The conversation will be convened by Justin Bengry, director of the Centre for Queer History at Goldsmiths, who has made the event possible, in collaboration with Isabel Downs, who stepped behind the camera there, who's a lecturer in queer history at Goldsmiths as well. Phil Polglaze is the photographer of these photographs, and he's a self-taught, very much South London photographer, who worked for a very long time with Southwark Council, and can still be seen photographing a lot around Dulwich and Peckham in particular. So if you're in the area, keep an eye out for Phil. Bruce Reid, on the other end of the table, is qualified as a solicitor in the 1970s and has worked in criminal defence ever since, both by running his own practice and as a freelance advocate in the criminal court system. He was one of the first solicitors to act for Gay Legal Advice, or GLAD, abbreviated, when it was set up in 1978, principally to aid those accused of cottaging offences. He helped to develop a successful approach to these cases by concentrating on the presentation of alternative facts as a form of evidence, as a form of defence. So this included, obviously, the photographs taken by Phil under his direction. Bruce has also undertaken cases against domestic violence towards women and for children taken into care. He is currently a consultant in the large London defence practice and still appears in court on a daily basis. Terry Munyard, who's sat next to Bruce, is a now retired barrister who did criminal law and inquests for 40 years. He specialised in political cases, including gay rights and Section 28 battles, and he became instrumental in legalising gay sex in Scotland and Northern Ireland. He also co-founded Gay Legal Advice, and he has a very interesting story about how this came about, which I hope he will share with us later. Some of the protest cases he was involved in include the Brixton and Broadwater Farm uprisings against police brutality towards the black community in the 1980s. He represented striking miners during the Great Strike of 1984-85, as well as families in the Fresh Hillsborough inquest in 2014-2016. He's also a founding member of the Charity Inquest, and some of his more recent cases included those that ended in with the Stance at 15, human rights activists who stopped a plane from deporting refugees to West Africa in 2017, and those convictions were overturned in 2021, I believe. So thank you all again for being here this evening. I will now hand the floor to Justin, so please join me in welcoming the panelists with a round of applause.
And we're off. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, explaining really the significance of these photos, of these stories. And as Yilka was saying, Phil Polglaze's photos tell us so much about London's history, and a significant part of that is the persecution of gay men for public sex. I think many of us are aware, of course, of the partial decriminalisation of sexual acts between men in 1967, but I think some people might be surprised to know that the continuation of the persecution of men, gay men, continued after that, and even escalated in many ways. So I want to start with some sort of context, some historical context to the legal and political landscape in which these pictures were taken. So if we can start with you, Bruce, could you describe us to some extent the ways in which gay men continued to be persecuted into the 1980s?
Well, you mentioned the word criminalised. I mean, in the way they weren't criminalised because they were always criminals. The whole point was that the conduct of same sex between men was illegal. It had certain exceptions to it, and the exceptions were closely circumscribed. I mean, for instance, chatting up someone could be charged as importuning for an immoral purpose. A passionate embrace on the street might amount to gross indecency, also a charge. And any same-sex sexual behaviour within a man of 17 years and 11 months was automatically illegal, and that also includes something like a threesome in the privacy of your own bedroom. So the short answer was that you had a starting point of criminality with a few exceptions to it. What then happened was there was obviously a movement in the 67 onwards which attempted to decriminalise or sort of provide a few more exceptions. But you then immediately had a reaction back against that by the forces of evil, Tory government included in that. I think anyone has heard of the National Viewers and Listeners Association, a very nasty bunch of progressive bigots who would campaign against any sort of filth on television. You had a police force which in itself was institutionally homophobic. You had the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, a man called James Anderton, and a highly unpleasant human being, actually in charge of a major city's police force, and you can imagine what that goes for the character of the officers under their command. In Northern Ireland, you have the Reverend Ian Paisley, who has a slogan for his election with "Save Ulster from Sodomy." Well, it was saved from sodomy until 1982. 67 it was legalised. It didn't actually get anywhere in Northern Ireland until 1982. So you had a reaction against liberalisation, but it was done mainly by the forces of the state, not Parliament. You generally had police officers saying, we've got to keep the lid on this. We've got to put this back in the box. We don't want these people free. We don't want them cluttering up the streets. We don't want to see it. Put them back. To do that, it meant that anyone who had overtly sexualised behaviour in public, or potentially sexualised behaviour, was at risk. it meant that the police would, on a habitual basis, certainly in London, install hides in public toilets in order to officers to observe through holes in the ceiling on some occasions, in order to photograph men who were interested in one another. You might have honey traps where you'd have one officer making eyes at someone who was there perhaps cruising, and then would proceed to fabricate the evidence against him. And the acts of actual entrapment were quite regular. Downright lies and fabrication were made up by officers, to the point where innocent people who might have been vaguely about to do something naughty were prosecuted and have potentially had their lives ruined. But it was very much a pushback against the overall move of society into making life slightly better for gay men.
Building on what Bruce has been talking about, Terry, could you explain some of the difference between legality and equality?
Yes, I'd like to say something, first of all, sort of background to the legislation. If you start with the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, Section 61 of that Act, which wasn't finally repealed until 2004, reads as follows: whosoever shall be convicted of the abominable crime of buggery will be sentenced to either life imprisonment or another sentence no less than 10 years. I've never seen in all my years as a criminal lawyer any act of parliament that contained an adjectival description, and particularly not in that vindictive way, of the offence itself. That gives you an idea of how the law was approaching gay sex in the Victorian era. In 1898 we had the Vagrancy Act, which introduced the offence of importuning. That was then codified in the 1956 Sexual Offences Act, which made it an offence to persistently importune for an immoral purpose. That was interpreted by the courts as to mean that any man who winked at another man, to be persistent you had to do two things. So you might walk over to him, that's one act, wink at him, that was enough to have people convicted of an offence of importuning for an immoral purpose. And then you had, in the 1956 Act, you also had the offence of gross indecency was created, which is an offence that only men could commit. You could only commit an act of gross indecency with another man. So that's the context, and all sorts of people were caught by these laws, well-known people, but of course the vast majority weren't well-known, but thousands of people had their lives ruined. Some killed themselves, others lost their families, their income, their livelihoods. That is no exaggeration. That's the sort of iniquitous result of these statutes, and it was because of that that the Wolfenden Commission was set up and looked into two areas of sexual offending. One was prostitution and one was gay sex. And the Wolfenden Commission reported in 1957, and in that year prostitution was legalised to an extent that it was taken indoors. It was indoors, it wasn't illegal. It took 10 years before gay sex in England and Wales was legalised, and that statute, the Sexual Offences Act 67, was piloted through Parliament by an MP called Leo Absey, who was a Labour MP. And Leo Absey in the 1980s I was asked to go onto a Newsnight programme, an interview with Leo Absey, because he was very hot under the collar about gay liberation marches and gay pride marches. And there he was, sitting next to me on television saying, you know, we didn't expect this sort of behaviour when we passed the 1967 Act. Well, actually, when you look at what the 1967 Act does, the 1967 Act partially legalised gay sex in very restrictive and discriminatory terms, only in England and Wales, didn't apply to Scotland, didn't apply to Northern Ireland. And what it did was it said that despite the law being that gay sex was illegal, it was now lawful if there were only two people involved, if they were both over the age of 21, and if it was in private. And it specifically excluded any behaviour in a public lavatory as being in private. So you could be locked, two of you, inside a cubicle, age 60, both of you, and that would still be illegal. You could be as quiet as church mice and emerge with nobody in any way offended, but you'd still have committed an offence. It also, curiously, did not apply to anyone in the merchant navy. You may say, well, what about the Royal Navy? The forces were already under completely restrictive anti-gay legislation, and that wasn't repealed for a very long time. But for some weird reason, and I haven't done the research, so I can't tell you what madness was behind it, but if you were a sailor, you couldn't have sex in, assuming you did have a cabin, on board your ship. You couldn't have sex with another man. So the legal restrictions were very, very tight. You were at risk then because as Justin said, the prosecutions then for gross indecency and for importuning shot up after the passing of the 1967 Act. And it wasn't just Tory governments. The 1967 Act was passed under a Labour government. Labour was back in power in 74 onwards. Labour could have done something about these prosecutions and changed the law. Sexual offending has always been what's regarded as a conscience matter, and so it's always been left to private members' bills. It's rarely been a government bill. So you had Section 28, which was introduced by a Tory backbencher called David Wilshire, but it had the strong, powerful backing of Margaret Thatcher, who spoke very much in favour of it. So even though that wasn't a government act, or government bill rather, it still had powerful government backing. So you've got this situation that up until the early 1980s, these persecutions of men continued at a pace. And I think it was partly to do with changing attitudes in the 80s, and partly to do with the fight back that some of us were involved in the courts that made people, first of all, it made the authorities realise they were wasting a huge amount of public money on destroying people's lives. The public became much more relaxed about sexual behaviour, particularly consensual sexual behaviour, and were much more willing to regard this police behaviour as the abuse rather than the men themselves who were involved in the acts for which they've been prosecuted. And the other thing is, this is worth bearing in mind, that the police almost always lie. And they almost always lied in most of the cases that I did. And we were able to demonstrate, thanks very much to Phil's photographs and the energy of solicitors and the handful of barristers who were doing these cases, we were able to demonstrate time and time again that they couldn't see what they said they'd seen. The police officers went into those toilet cubicles with tiny little holes in the door, or indeed in the false ceilings of the more modern toilets, to peer down through cracks in the false ceiling tiles, on the assumption that they only needed to watch a couple of people standing there long enough to assume that they were up to no good and then arrest them. And they assumed that a conviction would follow. And we started to fight back against that. I often had to explain to my client, you are not actually guilty of committing any offence. They thought they were guilty because they'd been arrested in a toilet, or they'd been arrested, as I was, late one night in the dark in Hyde Park, away from any path or street light. People assume that because they've been arrested, they must be guilty of something. And that was all part of the psyche and the psychology that we started to change, not just us, the lawyers, but also a growing public impatience with this terrible waste of police energy and human lives.
You've both given a sense of some of the scale of this issue and the impact it could have on people's lives. Do you have any sense across London of areas where there were particular crackdowns, or where police were particularly active in persecuting men on cottaging offences and public sex offences.
Well, there was a lot of my clients were arrested in South Kensington. There was a pub there called the Colhern and a number of other bars and public houses which catered to gay guys. And the result was there was a lot of activity. Some of it actually was cruising and some of it was sex in public. I mean, a particular set of hoardings were a favourite resort. That was cracked down upon, but it was cracked down on the basis that you were guilty by turning up. It wasn't that you were actually guilty or doing something. I mean, there was to a certain extent, with some of the open sexual activity, some cause for complaint by an outraged neighbour, but the problem was actually minimal in that sense. What the police used to do was simply cruise around and pick up the nearest queer-looking person, arrest them and charge them. And that was a particularly hot spot for that area because there are a lot of gay people there. Other hot spots grew up in and out of various parts of London simply because the local police force decided there was a problem to be dealt with. And we, like I said, we've got to get these people back in the closet. It really depended very much on the local police force and what their priorities were at the time. If you were dealing with if the burglars were under wraps, if you had managed to control street robbery, you had enough resources to be able to sort of put it on go and persecute a few gays, and there was never any problem with that as far as the police were concerned. You had a police force that would be quite willing to do it.
Can I just add that the hoardings, I'd forgotten about the hoardings,
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
happy memories of them. The hoardings that Bruce is talking about is a junction in Earl's Court. It's a big main junction, and there were these huge advertising hoardings. Nobody in their right mind would go behind these hoardings
For any other
for
purpose.
any purpose other than to meet another man for sex, and particularly at night. And you'd be, a passerby, the likelihood of a passerby ever, instead of walking up the street nipping behind these great big advertising hoardings, is ludicrous. So, but the police knew that was a place that gay men would go and have sex, and so that was easy pickings for them. And they didn't need to actually see what was happening. They just went in and they would arrest
Well,
people.
yeah, I mean, Rich Lane was guilt by association.
Yeah.
You just had to turn up.
Yes.
The other thing about Rich Lane was it's a 5-minute walk from the Colhern pub.
Yeah.
And this is what made it so handy in a way.
Mm.
So I must have been there 3 or 4 times over a period of several years. Always at night. Luckily enough, I managed to find nobody there. Carry on, Brian.
Well, this really tells another story as well about just the geographies of London, and Earl's Court and its gay and queer history is falling out of memory. When we talk about this in class, Earl's Court is new to my students as an area that had these communities and these associations. So there's more histories that are coming out of this conversation.
Yeah, well, that's because gay culture has been diffused far more widely across the capital than 2 or 3 small areas. It's been diluted. I mean, there are gay bars on every high street. Slight exaggeration, but I mean, it means that there's far more opportunity. And as a result, I mean, one thing actually we haven't mentioned was one of the reasons why this sort of behaviour in cottaging started to become popular was the fact that at the time, for gay people, opportunities for socialising were greatly constricted. You didn't have internet dating, you didn't have chat lines, you had very few bars. The bars that you went to were possibly a little bit risky to go into in case somebody saw you. So you needed to hide that, and it meant that the expression of sexuality was crammed into a far smaller space than it would otherwise have been, which means that you can look at these photographs and you see, this is disgusting. What are people doing this in here? That's why. Limited opportunities. and you had to keep it hidden.
And Bruce makes a very good point about who might have been seen. I mean, there were hundreds, thousands of men who never wanted to be identified by anyone as being gay, and yet they either were gay or they wanted to have sex with other men. I'm not going to put labels on everybody, but for the vast majority of those men, the prospect of going to a pub like the Coleman, where all the leather queens were spilling out onto the pavement, it was a non-starter. And I remember the first gay club I ever went to was literally just round the corner from there. It was the Catacombs. It was in the basement of a building round the corner from the Coleman. And what shocked me, I was about 21 or something, what shocked me was how ordinary all these men in there were. They were wearing cardigans. It was mind-boggling. But they were in there, not the Coleman, not the Boltons, not the other one. Collins over there, maybe I saw on the corner opposite.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put you on the spot. I can't remember its name. But let me deal head on with the toilets, sex in the toilets. I mean, a lot of the time, that was the obvious place you could go into, and nobody would assume that you were gay because you'd gone into a gents' toilet. So that was your perfect cover. And so, did sex go on in these toilets? Yes, in some cases. Quite a lot of the time, it was a place where you would just meet someone and go off somewhere else if you could, around the back of the hoardings, for example. Or in Highbury Fields, you could go out into the trees in the dark. But the point about toilets, sex, if it was taking place, usually somebody was on guard. And the minute there was a sound of anybody well, first of all, if it was apparent that there was someone in there who wasn't there for sexual contact, then nothing was likely to happen. If you started to make some sort of sexual contact, and it didn't necessarily mean touching, it meant showing each other, then the minute any sound happened of anybody else coming in, you'd revert back to normal positions.
Adjusting your dress before leaving.
Yes, exactly. There's a brilliant film that came out in the late 1970s, possibly 1980, called Taxi zum Klo, which is a German film made by a filmmaker called Frank Riplow, and it's about his life in Berlin. And it encapsulates everything that I'm trying to say, far better than I'm saying it. But it showed him in love, it showed him cruising in parks, it showed him cruising in toilets, it showed him at saunas and all sorts of things. But there's one wonderful scene where there's a group of about 5 men lined up at this long line of urinals, and they all move back in unison. I think they might have been on roller skates, but they all move back in unison, and then a door creaks or something, and everybody at the same time all goes zooming back to the urinals. It was like something out of a Busby Berkeley musical, low budget. But it was a classic example of the etiquette, if you like, of what went on in toilets. It wasn't men standing around wanking each other in full view of everybody. If that did happen, then it would have happened very much under the watchful eye of somebody who would alert anyone, the people taking part, to the fact that someone who was coming into the toilet just to use the toilet was coming by. So it was very rarely done in a way that could be said to offend people. Next thing is, why would you think of having sex in a place like that smelled and all the rest of it? Well, have any of you ever been to a nightclub in daytime? I mean, they're disgusting places in daytime. I grew up in Liverpool. I went to the Cavern Club, which is well known because of the Beatles. And in the cavern, it was a railway arch, and the sweat dripped on you from the ceiling. Not just your sweat. Everybody's sweat dripped on you as you got the night away. And if you think about that, you come home covered in all sorts of people's sweat. But that didn't put you off. It was exciting, and it was on a much lower scale. It was exciting for men finally to be able to meet someone in a place where they could express their sexual being. And that's why toilets was the focus of so much activity.
For the men who were arrested and who were defended, can you speak then to why photographic evidence like this was so crucial in their defence?
Well, I mean, that's largely because the police didn't actually prepare it very well. Most of the police evidence consisted of one or two police officers, and generally two, with absolutely identical statements. They were compiled together. They didn't contradict one another. There was no difference between them. Only the names had been changed at the top. And they thought and assumed that by turning up they'd simply get the conviction, which of course for a lot of time actually worked. Because as Terry said, you had to convince people to plead not guilty when they hadn't done anything. They needed actually to have the self-awareness to say, well, hang on, I didn't actually do anything on this. What you have to, on the face of it, you've got a small area from here to the end of this table squared. There are two coppers in it. There's two guys over there. You can't miss it, can you? One's going down on the other, isn't it? Yes. Case closed, isn't it, Sarge? Fine, okay, fine. How do you get round that? You have to construct an alternative set of facts or an alternative reality. Sometimes it would be enough, for instance, your client, properly outraged, to be able to demonstrate that they weren't guilty. But you actually have to try and break through that officer's recollection by saying, well, hang on a minute, you can't see it through that hole. If you put your eye up to that hole, you don't see what's happening over there. You can see it's happening in there, but nothing else. You've got the stall in the way. What you had to do is to take the photograph so that it demonstrated that alternative reality. Sometimes, frankly, we were creative. There was political reasoning behind this. We didn't like it. We wanted to do the best for our clients. And I would say to Phil, don't like that. Can we make this a bit smaller? Now, I mean, there's one occasion when we were trying to show that Clapham Common was a private place. It was underneath a tree. I looked at it and I thought, it's a tree. Not much to do with that, and it's not much wide open space. So I said to Phil, can you make it bigger? He said, yeah, wide angle. By the time he'd finished with it, it looked like the Gobi Desert. There was just no, it was obviously private. Well, it wasn't enough. It was about somebody taking the photograph which reflected the alternative reality.
But one thing about this case was the alleged offence took place at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And this is what you just think, this is so silly, really. And so when you think, wasn't there a rule in this park saying that you've got to be certain distances and this, that and the other that we had to follow? And so in the end you just think this is absolute insanity. 3 o'clock in the morning, so all you did was take a photograph. There's the tree, there's the park, with a wide angle because you needed to show the top of the canopy. This is the point. So if you took it on down, you couldn't see the amount of light that you couldn't see from above because it was a clear moonlit night. Anyway, so in the end, I have no idea what happened to the client, but the pictures, do you remember, Bruce?
Well, I don't remember, but that was what actually turned me on to the idea that, hang on, wait a minute, we can distort with this.
Well,
You can use a camera. The camera never lies. Anybody who's actually taken a few photographs knows that isn't true. You can always say the camera always does lie, but it allows you to present something alternative. And you've got to remember that nowadays you've got a phone which can take pretty much any real quality photographs. By point and shoot, I can do this, and believe me, I'm crap at it. But anybody can do that. What was happening in those days, in the 1980s, is you had primitive cameras, and people like myself and members of the jury and police did not understand that you take the photograph properly, you frame it properly, you take it at that angle, you make that depth of field, and it's different, completely different. Great, that's what you want, difference.
Well, I don't want to get too bogged down in anecdotes, but
You're going to, aren't you?
I'm going to give you another one. two of the cases I remember most vividly, I don't remember which toilet this was in, two police officers locked inside a cubicle. When we went to look at the, and they said they could see through little holes in the cubicle what these two men were up to at the urinals. When we went and looked, first of all, one of the holes was very high up and one of them was quite low down. And secondly, looking through either of them, you couldn't see very much at all. You could only see about 3 of maybe 8 urinals. And so I was cross-examining these police officers, well, how could you see through the top hole? And one of them said, well, one was sitting on the toilet seat and the other was standing behind him. And you know how tiny these cubicles are. Somehow he claimed he was standing behind him, standing up, looking through the hole in the top. But that would have meant his head would have been poking over the top of the door and perfectly visible. And my point about that is I go back to what I said earlier. They lie. They say we had these vantage points, we had these holes we could see through. That was what they were doing. Second case, the last one I ever did was in the 90s, and it was a toilet in Leytonstone in northeast London. And we didn't actually do photographs. What we did was we went to see the toilet, and the police officers had given a description of where the two men were and what they were doing, and where the police officers, were hiding behind a wall. So we went and we looked, and the wall was one of the thickest walls I've ever seen. It was about a foot thick, and it came out a long way, and when you looked round it at the urinals, you only got something like urinals 1 to 3, and they had them at 6 and 7. And so we took the judge and jury to the toilets in a shower bank. And I had to go downstairs first to clear out a poor old Sikh gentleman who was stuck inside. And then the judge and the jury and the ushers and the whole court went in there. Came out again, we went back to court, and the judge called us into his room, that's the prosecutor and 2 defence lawyers, and said, well, that's an end of it, isn't it? And the prosecutor said, well, I've spoken to the police officers and they'd like to be recalled to change their evidence and say we must have made a mistake about where the 2 men were. And I actually had to persuade the judge not to let them do that. They pinned their colours to the mast in the first place, and then the physical facts had demonstrated them to be liars. And it was only after some persuasion that the judge agreed, well, we won't proceed any further. And at that point, the prosecution had to throw their hand in because they couldn't rely on the accuracy of the police officer's evidence. So this is what we're up against. We're up against lies, we're up against distortions, but above all, we're up against the assumption that we just have to go in there and arrest a couple of men who've maybe loitered a bit too long at the toilet.
Having set up the context for the pictures so well and the impact of these and then how they can be used and why they were so important, Phil, how did you end up taking these pictures? What brought you into these cases?
Here we go. Twice upon a time. There was a pub in Tooting called the Gorringe Park Hotel. And to my right, I met this chap called Bruce. And with all of my other friends, we all got remarkably friendly. And eventually realised I was an amateur photographer. Although at the same time I was teaching at a large secondary school in South East London. And he said to me, Phil, he said, I've got a job for you to do. I said, no. Well, he said, there's a public toilet. And I said, you're crazy. He said, no. I said, well, tell me more about it. He said, well, unfortunately, the public toilet, and the first photograph on that list in front of you, somewhere, you've seen earlier on, was a public toilet in the Seven Sisters Road. So one Saturday morning back in 1978, I was 27, we got on a tube, we got out the tube, and the place was wrecked. There was a chain, wasn't there?
It was they trashed it.
They trashed it. So Bruce and I couldn't go. He said, no, what we've got to do is to rebuild the toilet.
Which is what we did.
So we did. We rebuilt the toilet. And there is an overall shot of a lovely, purely Victorian toilet with a checkered floor. It would have been unique. when it was designed back in 18 whenever. And one of the greater features that it had a central urinal, which you see in photograph number one. Anyway, so I photographed this toilet, printed the photographs, I gave the photographs to Bruce, and again, I would say 99% of the time I never pursued whether these people were innocent or guilty. The problem that I always faced was that, one, I was given information from somebody which you had to translate into visuals. And that was quite complex, because what you can see and what you can observe are two different things. And this is what we were talking about earlier on. That to establish certain sight lines, if you had to take the photograph correctly, and if you had to present this photograph to a judge and a jury, you would have a table of photographs all joining each other. You understand my point? Whereas with a wide-angle lens, and the mathematics of it, which I won't go into, pushes it away, but it increases the amount that you can see. And it's easier to use a wide-angle lens in certain areas, because at least if you're giving them to Terry or giving them to Bruce, and if you're giving them to a jury, you just turn the photograph over. Whereas, in reality, you would need 2 or 3, and if you can imagine 12 people on a jury with all these photographs in cross-examination, it'd become an absolute nightmare. Anyway, back to the story. They proved successful, and you think, hold on. So I thought, this is an interesting idea as a photographer, and so within some time I said to Bruce again, he said, well, I know some friends who are lawyers, and they may need photography. And so he chatted with various people. Before I knew it, in a period of 3 or 4 years, my work had been known in other areas of photography, as in scenes of murders, robberies, rapes, drugs cases, but all of the work that I was dealing with was for the defence of people. And the thing for me was that each of the photographs that I took, I knew that both the defence and the prosecution were going to use them. So neutrality was the critical part of everything that I did. And from there, and then also, if you look at the economics of it as a photographer, okay,
Well, Philip, just one thing.
Sure.
It wasn't neutrality, because it was more defensibility.
Yes, okay.
I mean, I always asked you, so look, if you're going to be cross-examined on this, if you're going to be asked awkward questions on it, can you justify it? If you can justify it, we'll use it. But we never tried to make it neutral. We tried to make it defendable.
Every photograph that was taken was basically a full stop. It was a point of reference. And so, over the years, the work increased. And again, by looking at the years here, I was going all over London, from the west, north, south, east, west, where people realised that because nobody else, as photographers, was doing this type of work. I'd found a niche in photography. And the economics as a photographer was that each member of the jury needed a set of photographs. And so what you would do, and as we're aware that there are 12 members on a jury, then you get a judge, the prosecution, the defence and the witness. You've got 16 sets of prints. So what you would do, that you were charging £1 per print. So in the end, you could, apart from getting paid to do the job, you would get paid on the amount of prints that are being used. So it became economic, but the downside was the risks that you had to take in some of these places. It's not as if I wasn't a policeman, I can't close these places down. So if you were sitting outside a park somewhere, you would sit on a bench and keep an eye on the toilet. And you would sit there for half an hour counting people coming in and people coming out. And if the same amount went in and came out, then you thought, right, I would go in. And at that point in time, through years of working with Terry and Bruce and many other solicitors and barristers, you will be given both the defence statements and the prosecution statements. And by reading up all this stuff the night before, so as you were entered, you had a good idea what you were looking for. And so all I was doing was making a film. Yeah, it was trying to make sure so that everybody knew what was going on. And also, I had a friend called Ian Fairweather who would draw, and Steve O'Connell, who drew the plans. Unfortunately, the planners never kept the plans, which is a real shame, because if you had the plans and you had the photographs, it would make game, set and match. But that's the way it goes.
Can I just make a point
Yeah.
to your, add to your point about all the toilets in here? If you look at them, when you come to 1990, photographs 22 down to 32, there are far fewer.
Yes.
From the 1990s,
Yes.
in the 1990s, in my experience, I was doing far fewer of these cases. The 1980s was when I had
Yeah.
most of my. Now that's partly a reflection of the successes we were having. We
Yeah.
won in the first 10 cases I did. We won 8 out of the 10.
That's good.
But it's also partly because I was going on to other sorts
Yeah.
of work, what was regarded as heavier work. But it's definitely true that by the 1990s, these prosecutions were shrinking in number.
I would say the greatest went from 84 to 91.
Yeah.
Although there's a list of 32 images in front of you, in a period of over 20 years I attended over 80 different locations in London. This would include both parks, cemeteries. See, the Brompton Cemetery was always very popular.
Yeah. With policemen dressed as
That's right.
clones,
Yeah.
because Brompton Cemetery was near the Coleherne,
Yeah.
which was leather and clone
Yeah.
men, and policemen would dress up in tight jeans, check shirts open to the navel, lie in the long grass, smiling at men who were doing the same, hoping to pick somebody up. And in one case I had where the policeman's description of what he was seeing was almost dripping off the page. I said to the jury, you may think that the policeman's account in his notebook tells you far more about what was going on in his mind than what was going on in the long grass a couple of grades over.
There was one occasion where they were called pretty police.
Yeah.
And it was, there were 2 or 3 cases where you had a good-looking young guy dressed in clone gear, and one description of him, I think they actually kept him out from calling it evidence, but he had his backside hanging out of a pair of leather chaps, cruising around, cruising people to the point where there would be some sort of sexual contact or some sort of importuning or some sort of mesmerising between them, and then then his 2 mates, in uniform, would suddenly materialise from out behind the bushes and arrest him. And I remember it was a glad move, I think. Okay, legal advice. We met with the commander of the local station to protest about this, and he flatly denied that there was anything like that going on, despite the fact that I'd seen this in officers' witness statements. It's quite appalling.
Yeah.
You've all three been actually very easy to chair. You've anticipated almost all of my questions, so I'm going to go into some final questions to start rounding us up now as we're approaching the hour. Phil, you've described the range of places that you photographed and experiencing these places. What impact do you think that your photos can have today, and what is their significance today beyond what their original purpose was for?
Well, for me, I managed to save all of the negatives that I took through my years of working for firms of solicitors and barristers. And I always knew that these photographs had some significance. That's why I kept them. And although many of the reasons for why I attended these places I've gone, all I know is that the majority have been knocked down. I mean, I look at these pictures and go, it's been bulldozed, that's gone, there's a shop there, there's this there, that's boarded up, this is gone, that's gone. They were awful places to go and photograph, I must admit. No one in their right mind wanted to do what I did, but you did. It was a job, in a way.
Well, joke is one thing. I mean, there is a playful aspect to some of your photographs.
Oh, yeah.
And strangely enough, there was actually moments of fun and levity in all this. I mean, the surreal idea of going into a toilet and reconstructing the bowls you can take a photograph of it in order to present it to a judge and jury is essentially ludicrous. You know, I didn't plan this at law school. Why am I ending up doing it? Well, hang on, wait a minute, I'm making money out of it.
That's right.
That's it.
Yeah,
It's a part of my life which I'm well glad is over, because the whole part of it was really horrible, but there were some strange moments.
I mean, for me, as I said earlier on, it was, you did what you had to do, you passed the photographs on, and you did the best that you could with all the paperwork and all the rest of it, but the follow-up and to find out if people were found guilty or innocent was not necessarily required. You did as, you know what I mean? You just didn't need to know, because you just trusted somebody when they're being passed on to use these pictures in cross-examination, to use them wisely, I would suggest. And obviously, I think that they did. I mean, we've done many work together. Bruce and I have done many work together over the years. And I can't remember which ones, but they all were some
We
really
had a far
horrible
better
cases.
success rate than was justified.
Yeah.
That's all we can say about it.
Well, I would say it was entirely justified. Can I just mention one thing? People have mentioned GLAD. GLAD was an organisation called Gay Legal Advice. It arose out of my being arrested in 1976 after midnight in Hyde Park, off the beaten track, in the dark, with my back against a tree, another man facing me wearing a long dark coat. It was a cold April night. And we were just holding each other, and suddenly I saw these strange lights going up and down coming towards us. And it was two police officers in uniform running over the uneven ground with their torches. And they arrested us and they took us to the Hyde Park police station. And it was a terrible, humiliating experience, and it took a year for my case to come on for trial. But one of the most humiliating aspects of it was, and this may sound funny, but it wasn't at the time. In the middle of the night I was asked, amongst other things, are your teeth your own? I mean, I now understand that was in case you choked on them when you were being held overnight in custody, but it was a terrible experience. The next morning I was in Bow Street Magistrates Court, in the very dock that Oscar Wilde had stood in, and I was holding on to the iron railings that run along the top of the dock, and the whole thing, it felt like I was at sea, the whole thing was going up and down. And I then went through, my co-defendant pleaded guilty. And they said that I was giving him a blowjob, which A, wasn't true, but B, they couldn't have seen it. They could not have seen what was going on, because they're coming at us. I've got my back to the tree, he's in front of me with a coat like that. So I knew they were lying, but it was a terrible ordeal to wait a whole year to come on to trial. When I was acquitted, I heard on the radio a social worker from Tower Hamlets called Ian Davis, who pleaded guilty to a cottaging case. Tower Hamlets had sacked him from his job as a senior social worker. He was ordered to be reinstated by the Employment Tribunal, a very rare event, reinstatement. And Tower Hamlets refused, and the union came out in support of him, in support of a gay man in the late 1970s. And he was reinstated. When I heard this, I got in touch with him, and we discovered we'd had the same solicitor, who we thought had dealt with each of us very insensitively. And so we set up GLAD, Gay Legal Advice, in order to get people to the right solicitors and get the right counsel in court to do their trial, and also support them during the time that they were waiting to come on for trial. And I started going to court. I was then a research officer writing about employment law. I started going to court and saw how badly they were represented by their barristers for the most part in their trials. And as a result of that, I then went into practice in 1980 and started doing these cases. So the two police officers who arrested me, their persecution backfired big time, because it actually inspired me to set up GLAD and fight these cases and meet these extraordinary people. Particularly this one.
One thing that comes out of all this is that if people stand up and try to make a change, if you don't plead guilty at the earliest opportunity, you say, look, I'm not taking this, I didn't do this. It encourages other people to do the same. And if other people are encouraged to do the same, you might have a chance of actually affecting social change. That happens incrementally, but there'll be some people on that jury who would have gone home and said, thought, why are the police bothering with this? They're lying. What's the be spending our taxpayers' money on this? That people stand up and people actually take the fight back. You do slowly begin to win.
Bruce and Terry, you've both spoken very powerfully about the need for these photos in defence of men charged with offences in the past, but how would you like to see people engage with these photos now?
Well, I think they'd probably think, look, this is pretty damn horrible, and I'm glad it's all changed. I mean, it hasn't miraculously changed, and there's still an awful lot wrong with society's attitude to gay sexuality. But it's important to look at this stuff and say, that's how it was. And if it has changed, why has it changed? Like I said earlier, because people started doing something about it. And it's small steps make, effect change.
But also you had AIDS, didn't you? Somewhere you had this fear that suddenly, again, it had happened, and people suddenly thought, right, we better not take a chance. Because don't forget, when you read the statements, for what it was said, someone would say, I met him, or I didn't meet him. There was no length of time, it was a matter of, and go. And that was the tragedy, really. I mean, where do you go?
Well, on a completely different note, but what do these photographs tell us? One of the things they tell us is there were far more public conveniences. And they were free. Go into any of the royal parks now, and you have to pay 20p to pee. Piccadilly Circus Station, where I did several cases arising out of Piccadilly Circus toilets. I went in there the other night before I came home on the tube, and there was a man standing at the barrier, the toilet attendant, had to pay 20p, and I said, this is outrageous. And he said, yes, and he held the turnstile through. And on my way out, I gave him 50p. No, I mean, there is a real need for more public toilets, and so many of these were closed down because they were associated with gay men.
Well, I mean, so much so that at the height of my practice in this field in the mid-80s, I wouldn't actually go in to a men's public toilet unless there was a woman with potential alibi outside with me. I was that stressed about, well, hang on a minute, any minute now, I'm going to come and get nicked for this, when I'm simply going in there for a pee. That was actually, a real fear at the time.
And Yilka, we started with you introducing everyone. Can I ask you, finally having worked with the Museum of London, what's the future of these pictures?
Well, I mean, first of all, obviously, I feel like they tell a story that has for a very long time been excluded from the official record, and in that sense they're quite special because we have a lot of written records and oral histories of this kind of stuff, maybe. But the visual records, this kind of visual record really doesn't exist. But also in a kind of broader sense, kind of adding on to what Terry was just saying, just a kind of broader picture of what's the relevance of these kind of archives today has to do with, the civil rights that still need to be defended, and a kind of conservative opposition that's happening again now, and whether it's to do with LGBTQ rights or women's rights or religion. I'm currently living in Amsterdam, where a government has just been selected that wants to close down all the mosques, and I think it's part of this bigger kind of societal conversation around protecting our rights, but also maybe these different kind of public spaces or urban spaces and how they can function as both a site of liberation as well as oppression. And within that, we live in an age of surveillance and privatization, as you say. There are hardly any public conveniences left. Everything gets commodified, and these spaces are disappearing. And so I feel like it fits into that broader picture, as well as questions of police brutality and complicity of the police and the government in this kind of oppression. So I think there's lots of different connections to be made to these archives. But certainly at the Museum of London, it's a very important story that we couldn't have told otherwise.
I think that's a great way to wind up this portion of the evening, but I'd like to invite you, we've got a little bit of time to, if you have any questions, I'd like to take a few questions if there is that, yes, you're...
I don't know if there are many, but this was incredibly fascinating. Thanks for both the personal testimonies and also like the wider social background. I have 3 questions. I'll ask all of them, but then feel free not to answer all of them because they are a little bit.
Yeah, all in one shot. Yeah.
I'll just ask them. So one thing is you mentioned that the peak was 1884, early 90s, and then from the 90s onwards there were less, and that was partly and greatly thanks to the work they were doing there. And I was wondering whether the HIV pandemic had also an impact on like space, socialization and all that also was part of that. So this is one question. One question is around the forensic evidence of photography. So from your story from your experience and telling about the time, there was also like a sort of lack of knowledge around the use of potential distortions of photography, and you could leverage on that, presenting evidence, although you were kind of playing with that. And I wonder, nowadays, like luckily we don't have cases as such in terms of in court, but like can photography still be used that way, or like is there like how the practice has changed?
As Bruce has said, in all the years I took photographs of the toilets, I never saw police produce any photographs at all.
No.
It was, I don't know why. I just think
they didn't prepare.
They didn't prepare. I mean, like as Bruce has said, when you got the statements, the police had identical statements, apart from the chap, whatever, who had been possible. And so it never fitted. Yes.
Can I just ask a question arising from that? I mean, Bruce talked about the defendability of your photographs, and I was just wondering, Phil, if you ever had to go to court to give evidence, and if your photographs were ever challenged in terms of,
It was a
lines of
nightmare.
vision.
Yeah, I mean, they were, but in the end, it was a matter of me. You have to think. You would. There would be the jury. There would be the judge, and they would. After it would be very technical questions, the apertures and shutter speeds and this, that, and the other. And then on occasion there would be somebody who would say, "Well, if you say by looking at the photograph in cross-examination." And they did have some very good prosecuting barristers, but you had to be firm with your convictions and say, you can't see it. And then they say, can you just answer the question? Is that right? Answer the question and don't get lost. And eventually, you did your bit, you said goodbye, and you walked out the door. But yes, I was cross-examining a couple of cases.
You mentioned what we think was the impact of HIV and the AIDS pandemic. It's hard to know, but it must, I'm sure, have had a big impact on the behaviour of all men seeking sex with other men, and it is almost bound to have reduced the number of times people would go out and risk meeting with a stranger and risk having any kind of risky sexual experience rather than risk being arrested. So I think it's impossible to quantify, but it must have been.
I think it must have done. I mean, it's the attitude of some of my clients who were arrested, but were actually having done anything sexually, a bit of importuning, was a case of, well, I actually wouldn't risk that now, not in this present climate. And that's only anecdotal. But it was certain. There was certainly a cloud came over at that time.
But also, I think there's the factor of you get the rise of the private gay club.
Yeah.
You know, where all of a sudden men can meet men in a club. So why would you need to go to a public toilet?
Well, things were changing
This
over
is it.
time, and coincidentally also with the arrival of AIDS and the world of gay clubbing and gay meeting places. The internet was starting up, and that was going to make a huge change. Somebody over here.
Yeah. Were there any other external threats when you were taking photographs from other groups of people who wanted to target gay men in public toilets? There was a story once you told me when I was a child about how you were photographing a toilet with my mum on the back of the bike, and then some men came back.
The story in if we go to photograph, whatever.
Where's your script?
There are two photographs that I printed in the list. And these photographs were taken at Surbiton Rail Station. Now, Surbiton Rail Station were a set of male and female toilets that were subterranean, located close to railway stations. Most of the toilets were near rail station, tube stations, parks, main roads, and a few obscure ones. But these ones were close to the spot. They had subterranean, but they were lit by a singular street lamp, which means my wife and I, before the kids were born, got on a bike, went to Surbiton. I took with, and I left my girlfriend with my motorbike, and I said, I'm going across the road. I had the paperwork with me, but it was so dark in there. It just didn't make any sense at all. You couldn't work anything out. So you had to put a flash on the camera and literally go bosh, 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 bosh. I left there, walked across the road, and this is the part, a car pulled up. 3 blokes got out with baseball bats. And they went down to the toilet. So if I was there with a camera in the darkness, I don't think I would have stood much chance. But that was another thing that no one talks about, gay bashing in public toilets. Again, that's what all these things
So what the police were doing was a form of gay bashing, of course. But you're talking about much more physical.
Yeah,
yes.
I was frightened to.
Yes.
But I mean, Phil, you and I always used to do it on a guerrilla tactic
Yes.
basis. You've never asked permission for this.
No.
You turn up, you look a bit weird, so people were scattered when you came in. And you go, right, need that one, I need that one, I need
That's
that one, I need that one, and you're out in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That meant that anybody who was legitimately cruising there had an opportunity of leaving. The person who was actually there for in order to relieve themselves would actually have scattered fairly early on, and you wouldn't have remained there long enough for security to turn up, or some nasty gay basher to come and decide you were doing something awful. But you did it very quickly.
It was a lot of hit and run stuff. You literally had to get in, as long as you knew what you're doing, snap, 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 and then you got out as fast as you could, because you never knew who's actually in there. I mean, one of the places I went in there with people I didn't know who were there. I was sitting outside for half an hour. You just get in and go. And anyway, Hugh, next question.
I think we have time for any final questions.
Any more questions?
Did we answer all of your?
Sorry.
Or did you get a chance
no,
to
I
give
had
your
just
third question?
I mean, a final one, which was an observation, which connects to the use of these photographs and the reflection that you made around the public space and toilet, and they're closed. But it's interesting because these are like still a place of contention when it comes to gender and sexuality. Is that like over time, like now we are looking into different debates, which is like gender neutral toilets, and so there's again, it was like homosexuality in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Now we are like again looking at this space, and this like it's a public space. I mean, the very few that are remain, but we still have. But it is also like a very heavy loaded space, and where all questions and themes around gender and sexuality are played well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a point very well made.
I think that's actually a really great point to end on, the real significance of these spaces. I mean, they're incredibly important to queer history. Now, obviously, there's contention around trans communities and histories and identities. There's longer histories of gender and access to toilets. There's so many histories that are bound up in these spaces that we've lost so many of, as Terry rightly pointed out.
There was one many years ago. I contacted Stonewall, and I sort of got all these negatives. They said we're not interested. I was most. I couldn't believe
You were
it.
upset, weren't you?
I was upset because again, as I said earlier on, I realised these pictures are valuable only because to me I always thought it was a part of gay history that people didn't want to talk about, that existed, that everyone wanted to just forget. And that's the thing that I thought it's important to balance up the truth that people had to go through within this physical moment in time in locations which are in anyone's mind are the worst places you could ever meet. Some of them, there were needles on the floor, there was toilet paper, it was just
Have
hell.
you ever been to a club?
Where are we going?
I think there's another question.
One more, sir.
Can I just really briefly ask, the collection is with the Museum of London. Is it, I mean, do you have to book and see it in the archive, or is it going to be digitised, or will there be an extra, like, how will we get to see these
Yeah,
pictures?
it has been digitised. I'm not sure if the individual photographs are available online yet. There is an article on the museum's web pages about it online. But yeah, I would advise you to reach out to the museum. I'm not sure if they're allowing, I'm not working at the museum anymore. I don't know if they're allowing researchers at the moment, but if they've been digitised, so they should be able to be shared in that way.
I think Phil referred to local authorities not keeping their plans, so that the word backup thing. There is actually a kind of quite long prehistory to images of public toilets.
Yeah.
In the City of London Corporation, they had these extraordinary lavatories which were designed and created for, the convenience of their citizens, and they're all recorded in magnificent detail in the City of London Archives, which is at LMA, of the plans and pictorial images of them as well.
The difference.
And they were regarded as kind of with civic pride.
Oh, yeah.
They were
wonderful.
magnificently fitted out with tilings and brass, and also they often, and until my experience in the 1970s and 80s when I worked in the museum, there would be a fully employed attendant there. So, you were not subject to any of these kinds of, you went in, you came out, you were watched by the person, and you went on your way. So there is a kind of aspect to this, which it's not just sorted, it was a kind of real, seen as an improvement in the records. They were kept by the city sewers department, which then became the public health department. So there is a kind of prehistory to this, if you want to have a preface to your story.
You can look at the architectural style of photography in toilets. Wonderful. But these have got a function to them. These photographs are different because somebody on a jury has got to look at them and make up their mind with the aid of a barrister or a solicitor to see whether somebody is innocent or guilty. Because if you look at them architecturally, you don't think that way. You think, that's a nice toilet. very happily post it.
Do visit Piccadilly.
Yes,
Really.
we went to Piccadilly at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning.
No.
Yes, you wore that sheriff's badge. I've got pictures to prove it.
That's a picture you have.
Oh, we're promising to give it to you for Christmas.
With that, why don't we wind things down?
That's a good idea.
First of all, let me thank Phil for preserving this
Thank you,
incredible
Phil.
archive of photographs. Thank you, Bruce, Terry, Phil, and
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for I hope you've had an entertaining evening. And remember, public toilets can be safe.
Please feel free to have another look at the photos, take one of the hand sheets. We're around to chat, take a card. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.